There's a very specific way institutions like the British monarchy make people disappear. Not with announcements.
Not with shouting.
Not even with visible conflict. They do it quietly.
Politely.
With seating charts, invitations that don't arrive, doors that no longer open automatically. And officially, nothing ever happens. No one is expelled. No one is punished. No one is excluded. According to every formal source, everything proceeds exactly as it should. And yet, when you line up the moments one by one, carefully, patiently, you start to notice something else entirely. A pattern so consistent it becomes impossible to ignore. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm just someone with a YouTube channel, too much time, and access to publicly available footage, reporting, and official explanations that somehow always explain everything while explaining nothing at all. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. But if you've ever wondered why the same, totally normal coincidences keep happening to the same people inside one of the most protocol-obsessed institutions on Earth, then buckle up. Because we're about to review a series of moments that individually mean absolutely nothing. But together? Chef's kiss. Almost artistic. Let's start with something simple. Absence. When King Charles was crowned, the entire world watched. Coronations aren't casual affairs. They're not birthday parties you skip if you're busy. Every invitation is deliberate. Every seat is negotiated. Every presence or absence carries meaning. And Meghan Markle wasn't there. No dramatic refusal. No last-minute excuse. Just not present. In royal terms, absence is its own language. We were told Prince Harry would attend. We were told Meghan would stay behind. At first, it was Archie's birthday. Perfectly reasonable. Then another explanation surfaced. A spiritual advisor. A need for distance. A suggestion that staying away was somehow better.
Choice.
Mutual understanding? Something else? The palace didn't clarify. It never does. And that's important, because this moment didn't exist on its own. It was one note in a much longer composition. To understand what came next, you have to understand how the monarchy handles emotion. Even grief has choreography. At Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, the world expected unity, solemnity, families standing together in shared loss. And on the surface, that's exactly what we saw. Polite faces, proper attire, no visible conflict. But then came the seating. Meghan Markle was placed in the second row, not among the senior, working royals, visibly separated from the central family group. Yes, there were explanations. Protocol, working versus non-working royals, rules that predated the event. All true, and yet optics matter, especially at a funeral watched by millions. Especially when grief is supposed to collapse hierarchy, not reinforce it. Social media noticed immediately. Analysts paused footage frame by frame. Because when distance appears during mourning, it doesn't feel accidental, even when it's technically correct. Then came the reception. World leaders attended. Senior royals hosted. Meghan was not invited. Again, procedurally justified. Non-working royal. Different tier. Different access. But procedure has a way of feeling personal when it repeats itself. And repetition is where things start to get interesting. For generations, one image has defined royal legitimacy more clearly than any speech or document. The Buckingham Palace balcony. It's where the monarchy presents itself as a hierarchy without saying a word. Early on, Meghan stood there, front row,
Smiling.
fully inside the frame. Then, quietly, the frame changed. A new policy was announced. Balcony appearances would be limited to working royals only. Administrative.
Clean.
Logical. Defensible. But the balcony isn't just a photo op. It's an archive. It's the image that gets remembered, republished, and taught to future generations. And once someone is removed from that image, something fundamental shifts. You're still family. You're still connected. But you are no longer part of the visual story being told. This wasn't unprecedented. Other figures have vanished from that balcony before. And every time it marked a recalibration of status. Not a scandal, not a punishment, a structural adjustment, which is what made this different from gossip. It wasn't emotional, it was institutional. By the time the Platinum Jubilee arrived, the message was no longer subtle. The event was designed to celebrate continuity, stability, 70 years of unbroken tradition. But for Meghan, it became something else entirely, a visual reclassification. No balcony, second row seating, minimal interaction with senior royals. And here's the thing about events like the Jubilee. Nothing is accidental. Seating is planned down to the inch. Camera angles are anticipated. The placement told a story without dialogue. Family, yes. Core, no. There were no tense exchanges, no icy stares, just polite distance. And that's what made it sharp. Hostility invites debate. Distance ends it. Body language did the rest. Brief conversations,
Quick glances.
no lingering moments caught on camera. Everything looked correct. And that was the point. This wasn't punishment. It was categorization. After that, the symbolism turned physical. When Meghan and Harry were asked to vacate Frogmore Cottage, the explanation was simple. Royal housing is reserved for those actively serving the institution. Practical, logical, neutral. But Frogmore wasn't just a house. It was access. A foothold inside Windsor. A permanent presence within the system itself. Once that was gone, everything changed. No more informal arrivals. No more quiet proximity to senior royals. No more being woven into the daily rhythm of palace life.
Distance stopped being symbolic.
It became architectural. Every visit now required permission. Every appearance became scheduled. Every interaction became formal. Inside the monarchy, policies are never neutral. They define who is inside the system and who is merely visiting it. And once Frogmore was gone, influence faded with it. Because in royal culture, closeness creates relevance. Distance dissolves it. And even when Meghan and Harry were inside palace walls, the boundaries were unmistakable. At one event, they reportedly entered an area reserved for senior working royals. There was no confrontation, no raised voices. Palace staff quietly redirected them. That was it. To outsiders, trivial. Inside a system built on hierarchy, unmistakable. Permissions had changed. And systems don't explain updates. They just enforce them. Timing in royal life is language. How long you stay matters. When you leave matters more. At a private birthday gathering for then Prince Charles, accounts described an atmosphere that was polite, but brief. Conversations ended early. The visit concluded sooner than expected. No scene, no announcement, just closure. In most families, that would mean nothing. In royal culture, it means everything. Invitations aren't about inclusion. They're about tolerance. Lingering signals approval. Early exits signal finality. As time went on, even the Queen herself began stepping back. Not loudly, not publicly, but deliberately. Meetings became rarer. Communication more formal. Opportunities fewer. The warmth didn't turn into hostility. It simply faded. And when the Queen withdrew, advocacy disappeared with her. Influence evaporated. This pattern didn't start in London. It began earlier on foreign soil, with a red carpet and a moment that lasted only seconds. During a royal tour in Morocco, Prince Harry stepped forward for a ceremonial inspection. Meghan followed instinctively. For a brief moment, she stepped ahead. A palace aide gently redirected her. No embarrassment, no tension, just correction. It seemed minor, but first corrections matter. They establish boundaries. From that moment on, similar adjustments followed. Quiet, consistent, hierarchy enforced without words. This wasn't rebuke. It was instruction. And once lines are drawn in royal protocol, they rarely move. Outside palace walls, another reality emerged. Royal status has limits. And beyond the institution, it doesn't always translate. At a high-end restaurant, a request for special accommodation reportedly tied to royal association was declined. No exceptions. No rearrangements. Just no. Inside the palace, hierarchy is automatic. Outside it, it must be earned. Individually, every one of these moments can be explained. Together, they form something else entirely. A trajectory, not expulsion. Repositioning. Quiet, controlled, and final. The monarchy didn't argue. It didn't explain. It adjusted the frame. And if you think that's where the story ends, the next chapter gets even darker. Because while cameras were quietly moving Meghan out of view, another battle was unfolding somewhere with no choreography at all. A courtroom, where patience ran thin. Authority pushed back. Warnings were issued. And even the legal team couldn't hold the line. That breakdown reveals what happens when royal expectations collide with real-world consequences. You don't want to miss that one. The difference between royal life and real life becomes painfully obvious the moment the camera stops following the script. Inside the palace, everything has choreography. Outside it, there are judges, schedules, rules, and consequences that don't care who you are or where you once stood on a balcony. And this is where the story takes a turn. Because once the protective layer of royal protocol fell away, something else was exposed. Friction, resistance, and a growing inability to control the narrative the way it had once been controlled for them. Prince Harry's legal battles were supposed to be about principle, about justice, about standing up to institutions. That was the framing. But courtrooms don't run on framing. They run on patience, precision, and restraint. And patience, as it turned out, was in short supply. Observers inside the courtroom described moments that felt off. Not explosive, not theatrical, just tense. A judge issuing unusually firm reminders. Legal arguments drifting away from evidence and toward emotion. Subtle warnings delivered from the bench that suggested the court was losing tolerance for theatrics. This wasn't a palace where discomfort could be smoothed over quietly. This was a system that pushes back. At one point, the tone reportedly shifted so noticeably that even Harry's own legal team appeared strained. Advisors aren't meant to manage feelings in court. They manage facts. And when facts don't land the way they're expected to, frustration starts leaking through. That frustration matters, because it reveals something deeper, a collision between royal expectation and institutional reality. Inside the monarchy, authority is inherited. Outside it, authority is earned moment by moment. And when those two worlds collide, the adjustment isn't gentle. What made these courtroom moments so striking wasn't anger. It was disbelief. The kind that comes when someone realizes in real time that the rules they're used to no longer apply. That the deference they expect isn't automatic. That titles don't translate into leverage. This wasn't humiliation. It was recalibration. And recalibration is uncomfortable when you're not used to it. Meanwhile, Meghan remained physically distant from these proceedings, but her presence lingered symbolically. Every absence was analyzed. Every silence interpreted. The same pattern repeated itself again. Distance, reduction, reframing. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. Public sympathy, once assumed, became conditional. Media narratives that once leaned protective grew sharper, less forgiving, more analytical.
The tone changed.
And when tone changes, momentum follows. What's fascinating is how none of this required confrontation. There were no explosive statements from the palace, no retaliatory interviews, no public corrections. Silence did all the work, because silence, when maintained long enough by an institution, becomes its own verdict. At this stage, something critical had happened. The story was no longer about what Meghan and Harry said or did. It was about what stopped happening around them. Invitations dried up. Spontaneous support vanished. Public defenses softened or disappeared altogether. Even allies became cautious, carefully worded, non-committal, because association in royal-adjacent circles is currency. And when someone's institutional value declines, people notice. This is how power fades. Not with scandal, with absence. The irony is that none of this required intention in the way people imagine. There didn't need to be a meeting where decisions were plotted.
Systems don't work like that.
They respond. They adjust. They enforce boundaries quietly and consistently until the result becomes unavoidable. By the time the public conversation caught up, the repositioning was already complete. Meghan and Harry still had their titles, still had their names, still had their platform, but the invisible scaffolding that once supported those things was gone. No palace buffer, no automatic deference, no institutional patience. And once that scaffolding disappears, everything feels heavier. Every misstep lands harder. Every complaint sounds louder. Every demand feels sharper. This is why the narrative began to fracture. The same arguments that once generated sympathy now generated fatigue. The same grievances that once sounded brave began to sound repetitive. Not because the issues vanished, but because the environment had changed. Royal life had ended. Real life had begun. And real life does not pause for perception management. What's most striking, when you zoom out, is how predictable the entire arc becomes in hindsight. The monarchy didn't punish. It didn't retaliate. It didn't lash out. It withdrew.
Slowly.
Methodically. Irreversibly. That's the lesson people often miss. The royal system doesn't remove people. It stops extending itself to them. And once that extension ends, there's no dramatic moment to point to. No single decision. Just a long series of doors that no longer open automatically. By the time you realize you're standing outside, the inside has already moved on. And that's where we are now. Watching the aftereffects. Watching the friction. Watching what happens when expectations formed inside one of the most insulated systems on Earth collide with institutions that don't bend, don't defer, and don't care about optics. If part one was about disappearing from the frame, part two is about what happens after the frame is gone entirely. Because when the camera stops protecting you, reality takes over. And reality doesn't do courtesy seating. It doesn't do silent adjustments. It does consequences. And the next part of this story goes even further. Because once the illusion of authority cracks, everything else follows.
Deals.
Influence.
Credibility.
And the quiet realization that the world you stepped into isn't obligated to treat you the way the one you left behind once did. If you think this story ends here, it doesn't. Because the most revealing chapter isn't about palaces or courtrooms at all. It's about what happens when the spotlight fades and there's nothing left to replace it. There's a moment in every public rise where attention stops feeling like oxygen and starts behaving like weather. Unpredictable, indifferent, impossible to command. For a long time, Meghan and Harry were the storm. Every appearance triggered headlines. Every statement dominated cycles. Silence itself became news. But storms don't last forever. Eventually, the sky clears. And when it does, what's left behind matters more than what passed through. The shift didn't announce itself. It never does. It arrived disguised as boredom. Media coverage didn't vanish overnight. It thinned. Headlines grew smaller. Language softened, then cooled. Stories that once led with outrage began leading with summaries. Analysis replaced alarm. Repetition replaced urgency. And repetition is lethal to narrative power. Because once the public feels they already know the story, curiosity dies. This is the phase public figures fear most.
Not backlash.
Not criticism. Fatigue. The same themes kept returning. The same grievances. The same framing. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the reaction changed. Comment sections stopped arguing and started sighing. Not angry. Tired. The most dangerous response of all. Streaming platforms noticed. Deals that were once framed as visionary began to feel speculative. Expectations that had been built on novelty collided with a reality that demanded delivery. And delivery is ruthless. It doesn't care about symbolism. It wants results, metrics, retention,
growth.
When those don't materialize, interest doesn't explode. It recedes. Projects arrived with enormous anticipation and left with quiet exits. No dramatic cancellations. No public feuds. Just phrases like strategic realignment and mutual decisions. Language that sounds neutral until you hear it enough times to recognize the pattern. Momentum slowing. Investment cooling. Confidence fading. What made this phase especially revealing was how little resistance there was from the broader ecosystem. Early on, allies defended aggressively. Commentators filled gaps. Supporters amplified narratives.
But now,
Silence again, or something close to it. Carefully worded neutrality. Distance. Because influence is social. It relies on people believing proximity has value. Once that belief weakens, association becomes optional. And optional quickly becomes avoidable. The public image didn't collapse. It thinned, became porous, less defined, less protected. The edges blurred. And when that happens, control slips. Interviews that once felt commanding began to feel defensive. Statements intended to clarify raised more questions than they answered. Emotional appeals lost traction not because they lacked sincerity, but because they lacked novelty. Audiences had heard them before. This is the cruel paradox of visibility. The more you rely on your story, the more trapped you become inside it. And outside that story, something else was happening. The world moved on. New crises, new figures, new controversies. Attention shifted elsewhere. Algorithms followed. And suddenly, being talked about required effort again. That effort showed. Attempts to reframe, to reposition, to pivot into new identities. Activist, producer, thought leader. Each move logical on its own. Together, they felt unfocused. Because identity, once fractured, is hard to reassemble in public view. The monarchy had once provided a frame. Even opposition to it had meaning because the institution gave it shape. Without that anchor, the narrative floated. And floating narratives don't command loyalty. They drift. What's striking is how little hostility accompanied this decline. No mass rejection. No unified backlash. Just diminishing returns. Which is far worse. Because outrage can be leveraged. Indifference cannot. By this point, something fundamental had changed. Meghan and Harry were no longer reacting to the system they left. They were reacting to the absence of one. And absence offers no resistance. No structure. No definition. You can't fight silence. You can only fill it. And filling it repeatedly with the same material leads to diminishing impact. This is where the spotlight becomes unforgiving. When it's bright, it hides imperfections. When it dims, it reveals them. Inconsistencies become visible. Contradictions linger longer. Statements are replayed without the cushion of context. And the audience notices. What once felt like courage began to feel like insistence. What once felt like vulnerability began to feel rehearsed. Not because intent changed, but because perception did. And perception, once shifted, is stubborn. This is the part of the story no one plans for. The long middle after the exit. After the drama, after the applause, where relevance must be rebuilt without the machinery that once guaranteed it. Some public figures manage it. They adapt. They evolve. They let old narratives die and allow new ones to form. Others cling. They repeat. They explain. They remind. And reminders rarely inspire. At this stage, the question wasn't whether Meghan and Harry had something to say. It was whether the world still needed to hear it in the same way. That's a brutal realization for anyone who once stood at the center of global attention. And it brings us to the quietest truth of all. Power doesn't disappear when you lose a title or a house or a balcony. It disappears when people stop arranging their attention around you. No press release announces that moment. No headline marks it. You only feel it when the phone rings less. When opportunities require persuasion instead of assumption. When visibility must be earned instead of granted. That's where this story now lives. Not in palaces. Not in courtrooms. But in the space between relevance and reinvention. And the hardest part? There's no one to blame. No villain to point to. No institution to confront.
Just time.
Audience memory. And the unforgiving economics of attention. Because once the spotlight fades, it doesn't come back just because you ask it to. It comes back only if the world decides it needs you again. And that decision is never in your hands.